Why do people tip? What do we do when the standard economic model gets it wrong? Behavioral economics is one way to understand real behavior. I'm Professor John List, and this is Economics for Everyone. You go to buy your coffee in the morning. After paying for your coffee, the screen goes to the tipping page. But you notice that the barista is watching you make your tipping decision. What will you do? Now let's change the scenario slightly. Instead of making the tip in front of the barista, suppose that the coffee shop sends you a text asking you to tip once you walk away. What will you do now? The standard way of economic thinking doesn't do a very good job of explaining behavior in such scenarios. Behavioral tendencies are more easily understood by augmenting our standard economic model. Behavioral economics is one way to supplement our economic model, as it uses variants of traditional economic assumptions, often with a psychological motivation, to explain and predict behavior and to provide policy prescriptions. Today we are going to lay out 4 principles of behavioral economics. We're then going to dig into 2 of them with some fun examples about how those 2 principles actually work in the real world. Principle 1, people try to choose the best feasible option, but they sometimes don't succeed. You might recognize this as basically a restatement of our optimization principle, but now we're allowing people to make mistakes, which sometimes, of course, we all make mistakes. Principle number 2, people have self-control problems. Think about how often you skip the doctor visit or the dentist visit, or our lack of solutions for climate change, or whether people drop out of high school or stay in school. These are the types of questions that, as humans, we don't really do a very good job at. That's because these types of questions have a short-term cost, but the benefits aren't accruing until the long run. And when people have self-control problems, we don't come up with very good solutions for these. Principle 3, people care, at least in part, about salient features or reference points in decision environments. I want you to think about the last time you went on an Uber or Lyft and you looked at a price quote. The price quote might have been $7.94 or $7.93. You probably really didn't notice that 1 penny difference. On the other hand, if the price quote was $8 versus $7.99, that might have actually attracted your attention. This is called left-digit bias. A lot of times as humans, we focus on the leftmost digit. Remember that the scientific method has 2 steps. A model is the first step. In this case, the model that you consider might be a model of inattention. People pay less attention to the cents of the price quote than to the dollars. But you might ask, well, how much less attention? This is where the second step of the scientific method enters, empiricism. When I was a chief economist at Lyft, we performed a large-scale field experiment with millions of observations to determine if people followed a model of inattention. One interesting finding is how people made choices around the integers. For example, when we gave people a price quote of $10.99, over 50% of them took the deal. Yet, if we raised the price by just a penny to $11, only roughly 48.5% of customers took the trip. In terms of testing economic theory, the data also point to an interesting finding. You might remember the law of demand. When price increases, quantity demanded decreases. Well, in our Lyft data, we find that the 1 penny change to the integer, say $10.99 to $11, that 1 cent change is responsible for 50% of the reason for the law of demand. The other 99 cents, from 11 to 11.99, That's responsible for the other 50% of the law of demand. From this result, one might conclude that behavioral economics is much more powerful than most surmise. Or likewise, the law of demand, one of our key laws in economics, the law of demand is much more behavioral than most believe. Principle 4. Although we mostly care about our own payoffs, we also care about the actions, intentions, and payoffs of others. For this example, let's stick with rideshare and think about the last time you took an Uber trip. Did you tip? Back when I was a chief economist at Uber, we rolled out tipping as a nationwide field experiment to explore questions around the economics of tipping and the economics of generosity. We included data from over 12 million riders who completed at least one UberX trip. How often do people tip? How much is tipped? Does face-to-face matter when people make the decision to tip? So let's start with who tips. Well, I'm here to give you some bad news. Only 1% of riders tip on every trip. Now, on the other side of the coin, 60% of people never ever tip. And then there are kind of the tweeners. 39% of people tip sometimes. Mostly this is if they get a spectacular trip, they tip. And if they get a not-so-good trip, they end up not tipping. The average tip is about $3. That turns out to be about 10 to 15% of the average fare. It's also interesting to note that women drivers are tipped much more often than male drivers, more than 10% more. Now let's go back to our question about does face-to-face matter for the tip. Remember, 3 out of 5 riders never tip. But guess what happens when I observe their tipping behavior when they're in a typical yellow cab? Remember what happens in the yellow cab. You settle up after the trip and you make the tip decision right in front of the driver. Of the people who never tipped on Uber, in this case, 95% or more tip every time. A behavioral economics model of social pressure and social norms can help us understand this dramatic difference in behavior. Behavioral economics represents a series of amendments, not refutations, of standard economic theory. Our 4 principles of behavioral economics provide a useful mapping of where and when we can expect behavioral economics to have an especially strong force. So now that you understand behavioral economics, you know, because economics is for everyone.